On May 26, 1780, a former British officer named Emmanuel Hesse led nearly 1,000 men, Sioux, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Ojibwe, Sac and Fox warriors, backed by 24 armed Canadian traders toward a fur-trading village on the Mississippi River. Hesse expected the whole affair to be over by nightfall. What Hesse's force rode into instead was a mile of freshly dug trenches and a stone tower loaded with cannons packed full of grape shot, a defense nobody in his coalition had planned for. Because nobody thought a bankrupt Spanish outpost of 300 people could build one in time. So how did a village that couldn't afford proper walls, led by a dying man with fewer than 30 trained soldiers, stop a force nearly 4 times its size from taking the entire Mississippi Valley? To understand why this afternoon mattered, you have to zoom out to 1778, 2 years earlier, 500 miles east. A 25-year-old Virginian named George Rogers Clark had just done something the British thought was impossible. He'd marched a tiny militia force through the Illinois wilderness and seized the British-held towns of Kaskaskia and Vincennes, effectively tearing the entire Illinois country out of British hands. Clark shouldn't have been able to hold what he'd taken. His men were unpaid, unsupplied, and stranded 1,000 miles from any Continental Army support. But on the other side of the Mississippi sat a Spanish colonial officer named Fernando de Leyva, freshly appointed lieutenant governor of a French fur trading village called St. Louis. Spain wasn't officially allied with the American rebels. Officially, Spain was neutral. Unofficially, de Leyva started quietly funneling Spanish gunpowder and supplies across the river to Clark's men, aid that historians now agree was decisive in keeping the Illinois country in American hands. The British noticed, and in June of 1779, Spain stopped pretending. Madrid formally declared war on Great Britain, and suddenly, St. Louis wasn't a neutral fur trading post that happened to be helping the rebels. It was an enemy target. In London, the colonial secretary Lord George Germain drew up a plan with a single, brutally simple objective: take the entire Mississippi River Valley. Not raid it, take it. And the plan started with erasing St. Louis from the map. Here's how thin the ice was on the Spanish side. At the time Germain's plan was set in motion, there were fewer than 40 regular Spanish soldiers in the whole of Upper Louisiana. Not in St. Louis, in the entire territory. De Leyva wrote to New Orleans asking for money, men, anything. He was refused. He was, for all practical purposes, on his own, defending a town of 700 people against a British Empire that had just decided this corner of the continent was worth conquering. This is where the actual weapon of this story enters, and it isn't a musket or a sword. It's a stone tower and the guns bolted inside it. De Leyva's original plan was ambitious: 4 stone watchtowers ringing the town, each one a self-contained strongpoint bristling with cannon. It was the kind of layered defense a real garrison town might build with real government money. De Leyva had neither. New Orleans wouldn't fund it. So he did something almost nobody in a colonial command position was willing to do. He opened his own pockets. Records show he personally put up 400 piastres of his own money, on top of a public subscription he begged out of the villagers themselves, to scrape together 1,000 piastres total. It was enough for exactly 1 tower, not 4. 1. That tower would be named Fort San Carlos, and it would go up on a hill near what's now the corner of 4th and Walnut Streets in downtown St. Louis, consecrated by the local priest in April of 1780, just 5 weeks before it would be tested. For guns, de Leyva didn't have the luxury of ordering new artillery from Spain. Instead, he sent men to strip 5 cannons, 3 4-pounders and 2 6-pounders, off an abandoned Spanish fort upriver on the Missouri and haul them back to St. Louis by boat. Second-hand guns, salvaged from a fort nobody was using anymore, bolted into a tower nobody expected to be finished in time. And here's the part every conventional military planner of the era would have dismissed outright. This wasn't a garrison of professional soldiers. It was villagers, fur traders, farmers, boatmen, men who'd never drilled a day in their lives, given muskets and a spot in a trench. On paper, this was not a defense. It was a bluff built out of borrowed guns and a public collection plate. Nobody watching from the British side believed a fortification funded by a subscription box could hold against 1,000 men. But Fernando de Leyba understood something the British planners refused to accept. A defender doesn't need trained soldiers if he can force every attacker into a single, narrow killing ground and meet them there with concentrated fire. Numbers only matter if the numbers can actually reach you. De Leyba wasn't trying to build an army that could beat 1,000 men in open battle. He was trying to build a funnel. One his cannon could cover from end to end, so that 1,000 men would never get the chance to fight as 1,000 men at all. So here's exactly what de Leyba built, piece by piece, in the weeks before the attack. First, the trench line. More than a mile of entrenchment was dug in front of the village, tracing roughly along what is now 4th Street, a continuous ditch and earthen bank that any attacking force would have to cross before reaching a single house. This wasn't a token barrier. It was a mile-long obstacle specifically designed to slow an attack down and hold it in the open, in range, for as long as possible. Second, the tower. Fort San Carlos sat on high ground with a commanding view over the entrenchment and the open fields beyond it. Its 5 guns weren't spread out, they were concentrated in one elevated position that could sweep the entire approach. And this is the detail almost nobody puts in the story. Those guns weren't loaded with solid shot for smashing walls. They were loaded with grape shot. Clusters of iron balls that turn a single cannon blast into something closer to a giant shotgun. Designed specifically to shred men in the open, not buildings. A 4-pounder loaded with grape shot, fired from elevation down a mile-long approach with nowhere to hide, is not a siege weapon. It's an execution machine for anyone caught crossing open ground. Third, intelligence. De Leyba wasn't caught flat-footed. Through a network of informants, a woman named Madame Honoré among them, along with a man named Pierre Prévost, another named John Conn, and a trader called Fontaine. De Leyba had roughly 6 weeks of advance warning that an attack was coming. That warning bought him time to call in reinforcements. By mid-May, around 150 additional militia arrived from the neighboring settlement of Sainte-Geneviève. Men de Leyba himself described in his own dispatches as all good shots. Fourth, the human positioning. When the alarm came, women and children weren't scattered. They were funneled into a single large stone building, the Leclade Chouteau House, sturdy enough to survive a raid, positioned well back from the fighting. Every able-bodied man had a pre-assigned station along the trench line. This wasn't improvised chaos. It was a rehearsed plan walked through in advance so that when the moment actually came, 300 amateur defenders would move like they'd done it before. And on May 23rd, 3 days before the attack, de Leyba's scouts reported the enemy force just 14 miles out, having landed their canoes and begun moving overland. He knew almost exactly how much time he had left. He used every hour of it. Now flip to the other side of that trench line. Emmanuel Hesse was a former British officer who'd gone into the fur trade, and crucially, he wasn't fighting for king and country so much as for cash. London's colonial secretary had authorized the campaign, but the men actually leading it on the ground had been recruited with a very specific incentive. Whoever helped take St. Louis would be handed control of the fur trade across the entire upper Mississippi. This was as much a hostile business takeover as a military campaign, and Hesse had spent the winter and spring assembling the muscle to pull it off, traveling through Great Lakes territory, promising native nations firearms, wealth, and captives in exchange for joining his coalition. By the time he reached the Mississippi, Hess commanded something close to 1,000 men, by some accounts as many as 1,200, a coalition on a scale nobody in this stretch of the continent had ever assembled. And on May 25th, the day before the attack, Hess sent scouting parties ahead to size up St. Louis's actual defenses. They came back with almost nothing useful. The fields outside the village were full of ordinary people, farmers, laborers, women and children going about a normal day's work. And Hess scouts simply couldn't get close enough through the daily traffic to see the mile of trenches or the tower waiting behind them. Hesse went into the attack the next day, still believing he was hitting an undefended trading post. He had every reason for confidence. He had the numbers, the momentum, and a scouting report that told him nothing was in his way. 1 o'clock in the afternoon, May 26, 1780. The attack begins in the fields, the same fields Hesse's scouts had used as cover the day before. Villagers working outside the walls are the first ones hit. And then, from a barn on a rise called Barn Hill, a man named Laurent Reed sees the attacking force break into the open and shouts the alarm. Within seconds, the whole village erupts into motion. A cannon fires from Fort San Carlos, the prearranged signal. A man sprints through the streets of St. Louis, screaming, "To arms!" The church bell starts ringing and doesn't stop. Women and children are moved into the Leclerc Chouteau house. Militia peel off from their homes and workshops and run for their assigned stations along the mile of trench that's been waiting for exactly this moment. One of them is a free black gunsmith, Pierre-Ignace de Valentin, whose job for the past several weeks has been keeping the village's weapons in working order. Weapons that are now, finally, being used for what he built them for. Another is a woman named Madame Rigoche, who pulls on her husband's militia coat and takes a position at the town's main gate, rallying the men around her to hold the line. Delaber himself is seriously ill. He has weeks to live, though nobody knows that yet, and he stands his post anyway, directing the defense from wherever the fighting is heaviest. The attacking coalition surges toward the entrenchment, looking for the fastest way through, expecting to find gaps in an amateur defense. Instead, they hit a mile of prepared trench line, manned by 300 defenders who've rehearsed exactly this moment. And above them, Fort San Carlos opens up. Grape shot from the tower's cannons tears down the length of the open ground the attackers have to cross. There's no cover out there. There was never meant to be. The effect is almost immediate. Within the first exchanges of cannon fire, the Sac and Fox contingent, a large portion of the attacking force, breaks off entirely and pulls back from the field. The psychological weight of concentrated artillery fire coming from an elevated stone tower, sweeping a killing ground the defenders had spent weeks preparing, does something raw numbers alone can't undo. For roughly 2 hours, the attacking force probes the line, looking for a way in that never opens up. And then, unable to breach it, Hesse's coalition begins to withdraw. Here's where the numbers get almost hard to believe, and historians studying the Spanish colonial records have double and triple checked them. Because on paper, they don't look real. Inside the 2-hour firefight itself, the actual assault on the trenches and the tower, the attacking coalition suffered only 4 men killed and 4 wounded. 4. Against a force that outnumbered the defenders roughly 3 or 4 to 1. The defenders' losses look worse on the surface. Delaber's own report logged 21 villagers killed, a number the town still commemorates by name every year. But here's the detail that flips the entire story. Almost none of those deaths happened inside the fortified line. They happened in the fields, before the alarm bell rang, among civilians caught outside the walls in the opening minutes of the attack, and in the retreat afterward, when the withdrawing force burned crops and dragged off captives from the unprotected countryside. Broader estimates put the total killed, wounded, and captured as high as 50 to 100 out of the village's 700 residents. But that toll was inflicted almost entirely on people who never made it inside the defense at all. Inside the trench line, behind the grape-shot-loaded tower, the amateur militia of St. Louis held a numerically superior professional coalition to single-digit casualties. 4 dead attackers stopped a 1,000-man invasion. That's not an exaggeration for effect, that's the number in the report. The consequences went well past that single afternoon. Across the river, at almost the exact same hour, a second wing of Hesse's coalition attacked the American-held village of Cahokia. And by sheer coincidence, George Rogers Clark himself, the man whose conquest of Illinois had started this whole chain of events 2 years earlier, had arrived there the night before. His reputation alone reportedly discouraged the attackers from pressing that assault as hard as they might have. Cahokia held too. With both attacks repelled on the same day, Lord Germain's grand plan to seize the Mississippi Valley collapsed in an afternoon. No further major attack was ever launched against St. Louis for the rest of the war. Spain kept its hold on Upper Louisiana all the way through to the peace in 1783, territory that, decades later, would become part of what the young United States bought outright in the Louisiana Purchase. If you want a scale comparison for what a small, well-positioned defense with concentrated firepower can do against overwhelming numbers, look almost a century later and an entire ocean away. The defense of Rorke's Drift in 1879, where roughly 150 British soldiers, many of them sick or wounded, held a hastily fortified mission station against thousands of Zulu warriors through a single brutal night. Different war, different continent, same underlying math. A small force, a chosen killing ground, and concentrated fire doing what raw numbers couldn't overcome. Rorke's Drift is one of the most decorated actions in British military history. 11 Victoria Crosses awarded for a single defense. St. Louis got a posthumous promotion for one dying officer and almost nothing else. Because here's the part of this story nobody tells you. Fernando de Leyva commanded that entire defense while seriously ill, and he died a little over a month later on June 28, 1780. The King of Spain, greatly pleased at the vigorous defense, promoted him to lieutenant colonel as a reward, a letter that arrived after he was already in the ground. He was buried beside his wife, who had died the previous September, leaving 2 young daughters who would eventually make their way back across the Atlantic to Spain. And in his own town, in his own lifetime, he was criticized for never publicly crediting the villagers who'd fought alongside him. The man who built the tower that saved the Mississippi Valley never lived to hear that it worked. Today, Fort San Carlos is gone, torn down in the early 19th century. The ground where the tower once stood, a commanding watch over that killing field, is now underneath Ballpark Village in downtown St. Louis, a few hundred feet from the seats of Busch Stadium, where thousands of people walk past a small historical marker every summer without knowing what happened there. Once a year, on May 28th, a small group still gathers at that marker and reads 22 names out loud. For one afternoon in 1780, that quiet stretch of pavement was the exact spot where the British Empire's last real chance at the American West went to die.